Hello and welcome to the Womb-Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Sama Morningstar and I have Clare Galloway with me here today. Clare and I wanted to come on here and talk about homeopathic medicine and how important homeopathics as well as herbalism are in our current day and age, especially with what's been going on with the big awakening around racial injustice. And I was really feeling a need to weave some connections with this work around earth-based approaches to healing and how that's connected to how the suppression of that approach to healing is interwoven and connected with racial injustice and racial capitalism. And I'll just start out to say that in my process of educating myself specifically about racial injustice and racial capitalism, it's become very clear that a lot of what we're seeing going on today, if we look at healing some of the ancestral roots of it, which I feel is very important from a womb-centered healing perspective, that if we don't recognize the traumas in our current lives, but also the traumas in our ancestors' lives that are perpetuating the unhealthy patterns that we're seeing in our lives today, then those patterns will continue to perpetuate. We really have to go back and bring healing to those ancestral roots of these patterns of inequity and trauma perpetuation. And so for me, this one of the big moments in this ancestral trauma was the witch burnings in Europe. Back at the same time that capitalist land ownership was getting more and more firmly established, because one of the ways that was facilitated was for the witches, who were the central part of the collective land owning community, and the communal land ownership that was going on. The witches were central to that and were the keepers of the knowledge about how to relate to the land, how to nourish ourselves, and how to heal ourselves with the land, and how to give back to the land and nourish the land and have these complex community relationships with the land, and that it was this whole spirituality of relating to the essence of the land as humans and being a part of that community. And they needed to be brutally murdered in order for this land ownership by the few to the neglect of the many to take place.
And demonized also, like the very nature of the magic that they were doing had to be demonized and polemicized, so that it was like the opposite of what we collectively want. So like in one foul swoop, we just wipe magic off the world, wipe the sacred feminine off the world, wipe the hearth of our tribe's connection with all things, like the interconnectedness of all things, just wipe it right out. Like very clever church-based, political-based, rich white men-based, masculine, distorted-based, very specific tool, very specific method of penetrating to the core of the thing and ripping it out, like ripping out the heart of community and the heart of everything that's vital about life, that we're literally just beginning to return to that now. Like there's a definite return to the core of things, return to womb, return to natural cycles, return to being connected again and being connected with each other. But there's still this domineering patriarchal idea that anything other than the patriarchal structure is really bad and evil, and it's tainted in some way, and anybody that you can shove outside that you know, private club or that special high, you know, place in the hierarchy way at the top, you know, and anything that you can put outside of that has to be, you know, it's part of the whole thing that it has to be outside. So anything that's natural, intuitive, vital, aligned with life, anything that's different because it's not this homogenized patriarchal thing. Anything that isn't that, like, just it's more and more enhanced, you know, the white flour and white sugar and everything, you know, and refined tobacco with chemicals in it, and coffee that's been, you know, all these magical things that have been removed from where they were in the world and how they were serving the communities and indigenous cultures they were serving, and everything about taking all the goodness, taking all the magic out of it. So it's really amazing that we're in this process of literally like making this boom, like turning things around, turning things on their head just now. And yeah, it's really important work to do the subtle, the deep, subtle inner work, and see the connection with that in the outside world, of what's going on in the outside world, to the heart of our world community, to the heart of the earth, to the magical relationship that we have with the world as a collective culture. So yeah, a lot of weaving going on, and a lot of weaving to be done, a lot of herbal tea to be drunk, a lot of steaming kettles to be done. So
yeah, it's true. And you know, the truth is that trauma of that process of murdering the witches and keepers of that wisdom and the celebrants of that wisdom, because that's who the witches really were and are celebrators of life, keepers of the wisdom of life. And that was the only way to validate the benefit of the few to the detriment of the many. Because at our core, when that hasn't been wounded, we know, and this is a womb wisdom, I feel, that we know how to care for everyone. And many of the traditions that we celebrate today in Christianity even are reminiscent of those times and can be reclaimed, like for example, the giving of gifts during at the Christmas holiday. That was originated in a tradition where there was more of a communal ownership of goods and services, where the community would make sure everyone had what they needed for the winter. And like you were sharing about earlier, you know, this was at a time in Europe when most people were subsistence farming. They would grow enough crops to survive through the winter when there was nothing growing. And so they would keep, you know, and, you know, once land ownership of the rich started to come into effect and dismantle that and require rents to be paid, so that the landowners weren't working the land, they were just extracting rent from the people who were working the land, then those people who were working the land, they couldn't produce enough to pay those rents and still not be starving. And so through the winter, and so then that process of doing that forced that these traumatized people who were being wrested from the way of life that they had been living with their ancestors for generations are then being, you know, torn away from that and sent to the cities, and running to the cities to try and find a livelihood there, where an inadequate livelihood being presented, you know, and then that trauma then led those people to participate in the genocide of people of color in the Americas and in Africa, because that was an opportunity to go and have a livelihood again and have land ownership again, or perhaps for the very downtrodden, just to become an indentured servant to pay off their debts. And so that kind of traumatization is at the root of then feeling so desperate to have some kind of livelihood that they would be willing to enact genocide, often under the orders of the landowners that they were indebted to, right? Or under the orders of the landowners that gave them land of their own. Out at the fringes, at the edges of the colonies, the poorer people who were gifted land out at the edges, that this was the chance to have land again and to be able to subsist, and then they were on the front lines to claim ownership of that land, which included enacting genocide upon the indigenous people there. And this has happened all over the world, and it's the foundation of the history of the United States and many countries all over the world, colonized countries all over the world. And so, but the origins of that is this trauma of being capitalized, if you will, of being commodified, and of that whole way of life of caring for each other being annihilated by land ownership and capitalism. And so this reclaiming of the wisdom of the witches, of saying, wait a second, we can heal ourselves, because this commodification of medicine and channeling it towards medical doctors, male medical doctors that were approved and sanctioned by the ruling classes, is going on at the same time in history at this time. So then we have now we have, like what you're talking about, is this, wait a second, this isn't working. We're not, especially women, we're not able to be healthy under these conditions. And especially our wombs just are like, this is completely wrong. Hello, this is not right. The way that food is being produced, the way that our lifestyles are organized around the benefit of the few to the detriment of the many, is just...
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Sama, but it's just, I'm so interested in this thread of how, like, the original wound, rather than the people, like, they did stand and fight. Like, I know in my own culture, we did stand and fight, and we did fight for our freedom, and we did try and defend our lands. But also there was a whole swathe of people that, like, once we were, perhaps when the indigenous wisdom was heavily enough suppressed, when the witches were burned, when the wise women and the wise men were burned or destroyed in some way, when they'd infiltrated with church and unnatural rhythms and political systems and economic systems that didn't relate to the natural flow of the land and so on, we then became so in bondage to the oppressor that we saw going to another continent, even as a convict, we saw going to another continent as a way of getting our freedom by doing exactly what the oppressor had done to us, like the exact same thing. So, like, all these generations afterwards, there's something that we have to unravel in that within ourselves, that we've been pursuing the mimicry of ownership of land, of sacred ownership of the land. We've been pursuing this happiness and this, acre and beautiful house and garden and whatever, and the 2.5 children. But it's really a mimicry of what we originally, the Eden that we originally lived in. That's kind of a joke in Scotland because of how difficult the climate is and so on. But the point being, it was all about leaving the primitive behind, because we were convinced by clever city people that the primitive was bad and evil, just like they convinced us that witches were evil. Then they convinced us that natives were savages and evil. Then they convinced us that slaves were savages and evil. now they're convincing us that young black men and women are savage and dangerous and evil, so much so that white police officers are so scared of them that they shoot them dead in front of themselves, because they're so scared this person's somehow going to contaminate them or put them in danger. There's in such a state of tension about that. But there's something about how we're woven into bondage with this, where we're all participating in it, because that fear and tension and pain and like just wrestling with life, like fighting with it rather than listening to it and making space for it, and knowing that we have the resources within us, which of course is the basis of Indigenous wisdom, that we have these resources around us and in us and in nature, and whatever we need will come to us. Whatever we need to give to the earth will come from us, and whatever we need to let go of will be taken back into the earth. Like we live in a complete parody of that, the idea that we get everything that we need from the supermarket, we flush everything we don't need down the toilet or into the garbage disposal system, and it all gets put in a big dump somewhere or poisons the water somewhere. Like it's a complete parody of a healthy life cycle, and a complete parody of that original dream we had of going to another land and living more easily, or reclaiming the land that was stolen from us by stealing someone else's land. And even the idea that in some ways, like North America was built on reclaiming our culture, but like it's kind of a parody of a culture. It's like really insubstantial. It's very superficial and fast and consumerism, and there's culture. Of course, there's culture there, but not in the way that culture should be, this enriched interweaving of all the people involved, and this rich celebration of life, and this rich celebration of season and resources and riches that we all have together.
Well, actually, the thing is, American culture is based on the capitalist approach of erasing any cultural things and making that and minimizing any cultural activities, because the celebratory European cultures that most of the European lineage of people came from would take, and just like any rich culture, there would be days of no work, of celebrating.
Yeah, there still are.
In Italy there are, but this was one of the things that, and the witches were the ones that facilitated a lot of those celebratory things. That's why I called them celebrants at a certain point. And that it wouldn't just be weddings, it wouldn't just be a few holidays in the year, but the whole capitalist approach was to vilify and eradicate those, because it took people out of the production phase of the work cycle for periods of time, and that diminished the profits of the capitalist owners, right? And so those were dismantled deliberately in order to make the general population more exploitable. And we see that to the extreme in the United States, and Italian immigrants and immigrants from Eastern Europe and all over Europe that weren't necessarily English, but even I feel like the English immigrants and the Scottish immigrants were asked at certain points, in order to be considered white in that club and to have access to those privileges that everyone was supposed to be working towards, the carrot at the end of the stick, if you will, there were actual ceremonies where you would go into this big melting pot, symbolic melting pot, but it was an actual pot. They were built, and there's photos of this, of people going in their traditional European cultural garments, and then stripping them off in the melting pot and putting on a suit and tie, or putting on, it was mostly the men that were, perhaps there were some ceremonies like this for women as well, but in order to be considered white, this was something that had to be done, was the stripping away of any cultural ties to the ancestral lineage. And
homogenous culture, so that everybody's the same, so that then you can feed people artificial things, because if they're not like looking for the real nourishment, the spiritual nourishment, the nourishment from the land, the real nourishment from weather and from connection and connection with each other, if you're just a little tick, 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 you know, a little pawn in the system, a little cog in the wheels and the machinery, then you've got nothing to put. There's no conflict with the machine. You know, you're just like part of a machine, and you just understand you're part of a machine. Whereas I think in recent years, like, it's maybe just reached its peak, you know, all of that, the homogenification of everything, you know, the commodifying of human life, it's kind of reaching its peak, where we get to, you know, trying to medicalize life itself, you know, medicalizing birth. Like, there was a brief window for a century there where they got to medicalize birth, but now it's just got to such a point where women have got nothing to lose, like nothing to lose apart from dying in a hospital, to birth on their own at home. You know, there's absolutely nothing to lose. So the beauty of that is that, you know, when people are so poor that they can't buy anything in shops anymore, the beauty of it is they go back to foraging, you know, they go back to having an agreement with their neighbour about using a garden, working with the land. They go back to learning about plants and finding where they can get fresh water from. And that's kind of, you know, that might be a really privileged view of being poor, but it is a reality that at a certain point, we get so little from this. We're so outside the comforts of the system, even if the comforts are a kind of parody of what the nourishment and the life force that we really want. But, you know, there's a point where there's nothing for us anyway. So, you know, what have we got to lose by going back to being connected with each other and helping each other out? And certainly one of the beautiful things about just now, about having been left to fend for ourselves, you know, people who usually would work hand to mouth and would work maybe even under the, you know, like under the tax system or whatever in the south of Italy. Everybody knows how to take care of each other. Everybody's taking food to each other. Everyone has excess of pasta or vegetables in the garden, and they're all supporting each other in that way, and nobody's going hungry. So yeah, waking up that connectedness again, it's powerful. Sharing
Yeah, and so it brings us to then the wisdom of the witches that we can claim from our European ancestry. And this is another thing that in order to address the continued stealing, because it wasn't just stealing of land, then when that cultural heritage was stripped from us, or we were forced into giving it up, then there's a hunger there, there's a need there, and so there's a tendency then, and which is very harmful to the indigenous people and the black people and the brown people, the people of color, to steal those traditions. And that's where cultural appropriation starts to come in, is when people of European descent are so hungry for what was lost, and instead of facing the pain of the persecution and harm that was done to us by our own people, we buy into this, oh, well, I can just steal it from these people and take what's missing in my heritage from someone else's heritage. Yeah. And now, you know, there's some complexity there, because there have been many indigenous medicine people, particularly here in the United States and in other places, in India certainly, and in South America, Central America, that saw the illness of the Europeans and gave their medicine to the European people in an attempt to heal that illness. But then, unfortunately, that illness of having been traumatized by capitalism originally, and having that heritage annihilated, that illness then most of the time drove those European recipients of these gifts to dishonor and exploit those gifts. And still is going on today. So I feel as an herbalist and as an activist, to be able to unpack that in myself, in my own practice, and in my conversations with other herbalists and earth-based spirituality practitioners of European descent, that it's our responsibility to really unpack how we are receiving those gifts from our Black, Brown, and Indigenous brothers and sisters and family members, and to come into solidarity and to really deepen our awareness of that and unpack how we may have internalized these trainings through our own ancestral trauma, of oh, it's too painful to look here at how my own people did this to me, and so I'm going to go and take it from somebody else. I'm going to go and just receive what's being given, what's still intact, despite all of the genocide that has taken place against these people, that it's still intact there. Wow. Amazing. And so powerful, and yet it is still intact in our European heritage as well. We just have to find it and face the pain of those original traumas. And I share about this a lot, and unpack how these subtle racist attitudes and complicities that we all are participating in because we've been steeped in that for generations, how those are harming us as European heritage holders, because and how it's preventing us from coming into solidarity with our actual who it behooves us to be in solidarity with, because being in solidarity unconsciously with the ruling class is not getting us anywhere, and it's harming us, and it's harming how we communicate with each other, how we relate to each other. It's keeping us isolated. It's keeping us away from the gifts of our heritage, which is a rich tradition of herbal medicine and rich traditions of wisdom from the land. And as we dive into that, there's more and more available to us to explore. And homeopathic medicine, we haven't even gotten there yet because we were just building up to it, and I'm afraid our time is running thin. But homeopathic is such a powerful way of working with the harmony that's already in place in our bodies, and the harmony in our bodies and with nature. It's so powerful, and it's been persecuted and maligned, just like at the same time as the witch burnings were happening and all that whole approach, the homeopathic approach to medicine. And I guess we're going to need to have a part 2. I knew a half an hour wasn't going to be enough time for us, Claire, but unfortunately. So this is just sort of the preamble to what we really want to say too about homeopathic medicine. So hopefully we can come together for a part 2 and get more into that. Is there a couple of words you want to say just to sort of whet the appetite of listeners for our part 2?
Yeah, I think something I talk about a lot in my work is how, although it seems like we have to go into something painful, and although it seems like we have to go somewhere else to get a thing, or like back to our roots even, all of that is within our bodily embodied wisdom. All of it's in our womb, all of it's in our sentience, and it comes through our sentience. It's not going to come through me finding a library of old books from Scotland. It's going to come through me, my own relationship throughout my lifetime with my own land and with the land that I live on now. And it comes through connection, like each moment I take to talk to a plant or interact with a plant and listen to the plant and watch its cycles and watch the weather and watch the precipitation and taste the water and be connected. And there's so many ways to do that. There's infinite ways to do that. So we're infinitely empowered to get more connected all the time. And then accordingly, once we're grounded and a bit more self-aware and a bit more humble in the face of the greatness and magic of nature, then we can start going out into the world and connecting with each other. But there's a certain amount of slowing this down and stopping consuming so much and stopping taking from the world so much before we can even start discussing, you know, the mess that we're all making collectively. It's like just slowing down and looking at what's actually around us is like, it's very accessible and it's very near to us right now. So yeah, some of the steps that we have to make are really pleasureful and immediate and easy and beautiful. So it's important to be inspired and the positive about it, as well as accepting that there's a lot of pain to deal with as well. And the pain stops us from connecting with our very physical self a lot of the time. So, which is the most necessary thing at the heart of all things, is our womb, our body, our embodied wisdom. So yeah, it always has to come back to that and coming back to wholeness.
And you have some wonderful training programs about that on your Patreon account, don't you?
Yeah, and I've got a school that I've got a course that I've opened up just now. I run an online art school, but I've got a course that I've opened up, which is essentially about living in the gift and living aligned with life and living aligned with our own gifts and the gifts of the world, rather than being in this desperate struggle to grab as much gift as we can from the world, you know, in a consumer way. So it's called the Zero Budget Millionaire, or the Low Income Millionaire, and I'm actually giving that away completely free to people of colour just now. Or you can even join my Patreon for as little as $1 a month and get access to all of that completely free. So yeah, I'm really happy to share that just now.
Beautiful. And listeners probably have heard me say many times, if you want to learn more about the womb-centered healing temple offerings, all of which are also available on full or partial scholarship for whoever might need that, please go to wombcenteredhealing.com. And so we'll have links in the show notes here for you to find those things. And yeah, that's all for now. Many blessings. And
thank you, Sama.
yeah, thank you. Blessings of the womb.